After I found out I was pregnant, my husband cried tears of joy. Everyone said I was lucky to have married into a wealthy family, but no one ever mentioned the woman he kept outside our marriage. I didn't make a scene. Instead, I quietly terminated the pregnancy. When the news got out, he flew back from London overnight. There's no conclusion to this story. It will haunt him for the rest of his life. Now, let's begin. 6 weeks along. Do you want to keep it? The doctor asked routinely, her head lowered as she reviewed the chart, waiting for my response. I lowered my eyes, gently placing my hand over my flat stomach, trembling uncontrollably. I couldn't answer right away. Grabbing my bag, I thanked the doctor and walked out. When fate offers a gift, it can be a blessing, but at the wrong time, it becomes a burden. This child's arrival felt like a crack in time, shattering 12 years of love and hate, leaving me devastated, as if struck by fire and icy winds. Once upon a time, Felix had longed for a child. Now, that same child had become a burden. Back then, we were young and carefree, too naive to measure the length of a lifetime. But Felix, at 18, was radiant, full of dreams, standing tall under the blazing sun. I tilted my head up and asked him, "What are you thinking about? You seem so lost in thought." He lowered his head, his long lashes trembling. "I'm thinking about my wish." "What wish?" He exaggerated a gasp. "Emma, I only have one wish in this lifetime and you can't even remember it. No one only has one wish in life. Stop trying to fool me." Felix's one wish at 18 was something I didn't learn until I was 22. In a shabby, drafty apartment with a cheap birthday cake, he whispered, "Emma and Felix, growing old together, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Manny, let's have a daughter someday. I hope she looks like you, big eyes, fair skin, waving her chubby little hands and calling me daddy. Surrounded by children and grandchildren." I clutched the test results in my hand as tears fell uncontrollably. Instinctively, I picked up my phone and called Felix. It was the first time I had reached out to him since our fallout 4 years ago. But the next moment, the call was cut off after just 2 rings. I stared blankly at my phone screen. Just then, a notification popped up from a news app. The headline was sensational. Sophie spotted with her wealthy boyfriend in an exclusive neighborhood, looking inseparable. Suppressing the discomfort in my chest, I shakily clicked on the article. Sophie rarely posted anything about Felix on public platforms. On the rare occasion she did, it was subtle, with Felix barely visible in the background. The media, too, avoided publishing clear photos of him. In the photo, Sophie's face was clearly visible, but the man beside her was only shown from the back. No one knew Felix better than I did. And then there was the hand in the photo. On his ring finger was a simple, inexpensive ring that stood out against his otherwise luxurious attire. That ring was the one I had saved up for half a year to buy during my first year of work. Even after Felix became a billionaire with countless publicly traded companies under his name, we still use those rings to exchange vows at our wedding. "Felix, do you take Emma to be your wife, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and cherish her faithfully for as long as you both shall live? Are you ready to leave this world?" "I am." Sitting on the cold metal chair outside the room, I let out a mocking laugh, but I couldn't stop the bitterness welling up inside me. The irony was that just moments ago, I had hesitated because of this unexpected child. I picked up my phone and sent Felix a message. "Come home when you have time. I have something to tell you." Surprisingly, he replied almost immediately, "Been busy lately. If it's urgent, contact my secretary." Over the years, Felix's business had grown exponentially. His assets were now countless. We had lived in a basement, then in a shabby a-month rental apartment, and now we resided in a mansion worth millions. But after that day, I didn't wait for Felix to come home. Instead, someone else showed up. It was at a small private gathering with a few of Felix's friends. I had no idea how Sophie managed to get into the inner room. She stopped me in the hallway. The moment she saw me, she froze for a second, then smirked. "Men are such pigs," she sneered. "No matter how beautiful the flower at home is, they can't resist eating trash outside." It was her first time meeting me, but it wasn't my first time seeing her. She was a dazzling celebrity, her face plastered on every street corner. Before I could respond, a voice came from behind me, dripping with sarcasm. "At least you know you're the trash outside." Sophie's face darkened instantly, realizing her slip of the tongue. I turned to see who had spoken. It was Dylan, Felix's childhood friend and now his business partner. I smiled politely at him, acknowledging his presence. This wasn't Sophie's first attempt to provoke me. 2 years ago she had called me once. When I answered, she smugly asked, "Alex, will you divorce your wife and marry me?" I guessed it was her way of declaring war. On the other end of the line, I heard a faint rustling sound. Then, Felix's cold, impatient voice came through. "Sophie, get the hell away from me at the hotel." "Alex, you..." The call was abruptly cut off. I stared at the phone for a long time, stunned. 2 years ago, she had only dared to play her games in secret, but now she had the audacity to confront me openly. I couldn't think of any reason for her confidence except that Felix must have given her some sort of promise. Even so, I had no interest in arguing with her. I turned to leave, but she blocked my path, raising an eyebrow. "Emma, you and Alex have been at odds for so many years. There's no love left between you two. Dragging this out will only make things uglier. Why not let go and let true love prevail?" I let out a cold laugh and replied, enunciating each word clearly. "True love." She crossed her arms, smug and self-satisfied. "Yes, Alex and I are truly in love. In a relationship, the one who isn't loved should step aside. So, Emma, it's you who should leave." I stared at her coldly, tearing away all pretense. "Being a mistress and feeling no shame, how proud you must be. Felix and I are married. Between us, whether it's life or death, reconciliation or divorce, even if I have to drag this out with him for a lifetime, it's none of your business. You, standing here so arrogantly, demanding I step aside, what gives you the right?" She seemed startled, taking a small step back. Then she placed her hand on her stomach and raised her voice. "Because I'm carrying his child." My gaze instinctively shifted to her abdomen. In that moment, Sophie's words spiraled in my mind, drilling into my very core. The pain, pregnant, a child. I felt dizzy, as if the whole world was spinning. She saw me freeze, raised her eyebrows, and quickly said, "You've been married for so many years and still don't have a child. The one in my belly is her first child. Do you think she'll marry me for this child?" I suddenly burst out laughing, finding everything in front of me utterly meaningless. My whole body felt drained, my limbs weak. At that moment, Dylan, standing beside me, reached out to steady me. "Are you okay?" he asked. I smiled at him. "Did you hear that? Felix's first child." Dylan pressed his lips together but said nothing. Just then, the sound of footsteps came from behind Sophie. I looked up. It was Felix, whom I hadn't seen in days. His face was cold, his tailored suit under a black coat, his refined and handsome features shadowed by a furrowed brow. Felix glanced at me, his dark, unreadable eyes landing on Dylan's hand supporting me. Sophie called out to him excitedly, but in the next second Felix's face turned icy. Without hesitation, he grabbed her hair and demanded harshly, "Who told you to come near her? Do you have a death wish?" Sophie screamed, crying out, "Alex, I didn't mean to. I'm pregnant with your child. Your child. Don't you care at all?" Felix's expression darkened as he let out a chilling laugh. "Are you sure it's my child?" He suddenly released her, his voice cold. "Get out." Sophie clutched her head, not daring to look at him again, and stumbled away in a panic. After she left, the empty hallway was silent, leaving just the three of us. The quiet stretched uncomfortably. Suddenly, Felix tilted his head and looked at Dylan. "Dylan, do you like Emma?" Dylan's face turned bright red at his words, stammering, What nonsense are you talking about?" Felix didn't care what Dylan said. His dark eyes locked firmly on me, but his words were directed at Dylan. "Even if you like her, it's useless. Emma is my wife. She can only be with me in this lifetime." After saying this, Felix withdrew his gaze and turned to leave. I saw Dylan chase after him, scolding him in a low voice. "Felix, if you keep acting like this, aren't you afraid Emma will divorce you?" The word divorce seemed to strike a nerve in Felix. He stopped in his tracks, pausing for a moment before replying, "She won't." I looked down at my phone where Dylan had sent me a message. "That jerk is only so confident because he knows you love him." Dylan was a notorious playboy. The world said he was a flirt, and he himself claimed he hadn't married yet because he didn't want to lose his freedom. Even Dylan thought Felix was a jerk. "So, Felix, how can you be so sure I'll love you forever? Perhaps when we're young, we never imagine that deep love in our youth can one day turn into resentment and hostility." At 17, Felix had it all: knowledge, a good family, looks, and a great personality. He was the brightest star at West High School. Back then, I didn't understand why, in a crowd of people, my eyes only sought his. Later, I realized that when someone becomes your whole world, there's no escaping their gaze. At that time, I was bold and passionate, and no one would have believed Felix liked me. Yet through all those years of spring and summer, he stayed close behind me. He never avoided it, never feared being called out by teachers. He declared openly, "What does it matter if I like Emma? If you want to punish someone, punish me." I had a crush on him, but he didn't know anything about it. Puppy love? No, it wasn't even that, just one-sided infatuation. I was still in the pursuit phase. How happy was I back then? My lips would curl up slightly, my eyes brimming with laughter as I looked at him. I'd secretly tug on the corner of his jacket. "Felix, tone it down a bit and focus on your studies," I'd say. Felix, dressed in a black windbreaker, stood with a laid-back posture, his head tilted down as he looked at me. His bangs naturally fell across his forehead, partially covering his almond-shaped eyes, the corners of which tilted up ever so slightly. "No can do," he replied. "Dylan told me there are a bunch of guys at school who have their eyes on you. I need to make sure they back off." How arrogant was he? He'd lean against the podium in class, casually twirling a piece of chalk between his fingers, solving math problems no one else could figure out. While solving, he'd lazily explain to the class, "Point E is where XM intersects FC." As he finished drawing the diagram, a collective "Oh" rose from the students below. Amid the enthusiastic cheers, Felix turned his head to look at me. The golden glow of the setting sun streamed in through the doorway, and he gave the faintest hint of a smile. I quickly raised my book to hide my face, but behind the pages filled with the scent of ink, my ears turned red. Back then, the spring breeze carried a gentle warmth, mingling with the sweet, plum-like secrets of a young girl's heart. It also rustled the white shirts of the boys, their school uniforms billowing in the wind, encapsulating the grandeur of youth. At that time, everyone envied us, saying we were a perfect match, destined to last forever. The year we took our college entrance exams, we got into the same university, though we chose different majors. The first time Felix waited for me after class, my roommate Sophie excitedly shook my arm. "Emma! Oh my gosh, there's a super handsome guy waiting for you outside." I asked around. "He's Felix from the computer science department." I glanced out the window and saw Felix leaning against the railing. He stood tall, his figure striking amidst the bustling crowd, as noticeable as a beacon. I smiled at him and thought to myself, "Felix, I know you." Back then, he spoiled me endlessly, making me more and more demanding. If I craved something in the middle of the night, he'd show up early the next morning with something warm in hand, waiting outside my dorm. During college, we were like countless other couples, clingy and passionate. Whenever he leaned in to kiss me, I'd pout and complain, "You're always distracting me. I can't even study properly. If I fail my finals, you won't see me again." Felix would chuckle softly, I'm sorry. It's my fault. How about this? We'll go to the library. You can work on your assignments and I won't say a word, okay? Sophie used to describe us as childish yet enviable to the point of frustration. In our junior year, Felix's father passed away, exposing the crumbling foundation of the family business. His mother, overwhelmed by debt collectors, took her own life. Overnight, the golden boy fell from grace, left with nothing. For nearly a month, I didn't see Felix. Then one day, he emerged from his room, shoulders slumped, looking gaunt. The first thing he said was, "You should leave. I don't want to drag you down with me." I glared at him, my teeth clenched. "What do you think I like about you? Your money? Your family background? Felix, you're such a jerk." Tears streamed down my face, one after another, no matter how hard I tried to wipe them away. He stepped forward, bent down, and gently wiped my tears. "Don't cry, Emmy. I can't let go of you, but how could I ask you to stay with someone like me?" Back then, Felix stood alone, with no family to turn to and no light on the road ahead. But no matter what, Felix's wish had never changed. He still wanted to grow old with Emma, surrounded by children and grandchildren. When Felix first started his business, he struggled to gather the initial funds. I secretly gave him the dowry money my mom had saved for me. When he found out where the money came from, he rested his head on my shoulder, pressing the back of my neck with one hand to stop me from turning to look at him. "Silly girl," he said. "No matter how incapable I am, I won't use your money. Keep it safe. One day it'll be spent where it truly matters." Later, when his business was just starting to show promise, he faced difficulties with investors. One night, he was forced to drink a glass of whiskey for every $10,000 he wanted to secure. That night, he managed to pull in $2 million in investments, but ended up in an ambulance due to a perforated stomach. Back then, he often worked late into the night. Sometimes when his stomach ached from staying up too long, he'd come into the bedroom, pressing his cold face into the palm of my hand, softly and pitifully calling out, "Emmy." I was a deep sleeper, but I always woke up at the first sound of his voice. When he was utterly exhausted, he'd bury his head in my lap and rest with his eyes closed. I would gently massage his stomach with one hand while the other stroked the back of his head, where his neatly trimmed short hair was jet black and thick, the part of him I loved the most. He once said, "Emmy, I won't let you regret being with me." Later, on the peak of a snowy mountain with the endless icy wind as his symphony, and at St. Nicholas Bay, where massive waves became my wedding veil, Felix's proposal shook the world. Countless people online tried to uncover the story behind the grand proposal. "Emma, will you marry me?" he had asked. How did I respond back then? I remember now, my eyes were filled with him as I covered my mouth, happiness spilling out through my gaze. My rationality crumbled, and my faith turned into a feverish devotion. Sincerely and reverently I said, "Yes, Felix, I love you so, so much." I've asked myself countless times, do I regret the choice I made back then? I've thought about it over and over. Even though the ending turned out less than ideal, I don't regret loving him. Those 12 years, though they may have been a reckless mistake in the story of my youth, were also the bravest chapter of my life. Fate is cruel, but it's also kind. Its kindness lies in the fact that as long as you keep moving forward, it will always carve out a path for you. I never wanted to look at Sophie, but Felix had elevated her so high. She went from being an unknown, struggling actress to a household name. Her presence infiltrated every corner of my life. As I lowered my head to search for the contact information of an obstetrician, her posts popped up on my screen again. One was a selfie she took at a movie theater, and another showed a brightly lit mansion, rows upon rows of jewelry, and unopened designer bags. The caption read, "Since the apology was sincere enough, this princess will forgive you." Anyone could tell that someone had rented out the theater to watch a movie with her, and the pile of bags and jewelry was worth no less than $2 million. I closed my phone expressionlessly. My heart, already hollow, didn't stir in the slightest. Just then, I heard a sound from the entryway. I looked up. Felix was standing there, his coat draped over his arm as he bent down to change into his slippers. Sensing something, he looked up at me sitting on the couch. "Still up this late?" His tone was light, as if he were just coming home from a day at work, casually greeting his wife. I looked at him and smiled. "You went to the movies with Sophie?" Felix froze mid-motion, surprised as he looked at me, as if wondering why I would ask such a question. And why not? After all these years, this was the first time I ever had. In front of the two of them, when Sophie was mentioned, she froze for a moment, then picked up the pack of cigarettes on the coffee table. Casually, she pulled one out and lit it with a sleek silver lighter. The sharp click echoed in the room. Felix leaned back against the sofa, the cigarette between his fingers glowing amber. His expression was layered with unreadable emotions. I squinted at him and asked, "Do you care?" I looked at the cigarette in her hand, instinctively placing my hand on my stomach. But then I reconsidered and put my hand down. "Did you care when I cared?" I asked her with a faint smile. She should have known I was referring to what happened 4 years ago. That incident was the beginning of our shattered marriage. Back then, Sophie was an 18-year-old rookie, full of youthful charm. It was the prime of her life. She would look up at him with her dewy eyes and call him Vice President. I was so confident then. Confident that as long as Felix held his ground, no one else could pose a threat. But in the end, I overestimated Felix's love for me and underestimated my own possessiveness. She unknowingly intrigued him, drawing him closer step by step. She would send him goodnight messages every day on WhatsApp. And there I was, like a madwoman, losing all reason because I cared too much. But at that time, she couldn't even be bothered to argue with me. While I was putting on a dramatic one-woman show, she simply furrowed her brows, impatiently saying, "If she misunderstands, what can I do?" With red eyes and bare feet, I screamed at the top of my lungs, "You're despicable!" If you hadn't given her a chance, how could she have misunderstood? If you hadn't made her promises, how could she have tried to kill herself? If Felix hadn't had feelings for her, where would she have gotten the courage to challenge me? She looked at me with a tone so cold it was almost indifferent. "Emma, you look like a lunatic right now." In that moment, it felt like we had gone from being the two people who loved each other most in the world to the most terrifying enemies. Pulling myself out of the memory, I broke the long silence in the empty living room. My tone was firm. "Felix, let's get a divorce." Just then, the cigarette in her hand burned down to the filter. She flinched as it scorched her fingers, quickly extinguishing it with trembling hands. Then, she dared to look up at me. But after just one glance, she lowered her head again, as if afraid to meet my gaze. Her hand clenched the cigarette pack tightly, producing a dull crunching sound. No one knew what thoughts were running through her mind during that silence. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice halting. "Is it because of Sophie?" She pondered, then slowly said, "If you say you care, I can make her disappear." When did Felix, who used to be so pure and transparent, become so ruthless and selfish? I asked her, "She's still carrying your child." "That's not my child," Felix said. a crooked smile playing on her lips. You believe everything she says. Just because she says it's mine, it is. My child can only be. Felix, I interrupted her calmly. I don't care. Whether it's Sophie or someone else, I don't care anymore. So, you don't need to tell me any of this. All I want is for you to agree to the divorce. Felix's face turned as pale as paper. A twisted smile flickered in her eyes. Of course you don't care. Emma, you're nothing but a dead pool of water now. Even if I died right in front of you, you wouldn't bat an eye. What else could you possibly care about? I no longer had the desire to argue with her. It felt like watching a spoiled child throw a tantrum. Like a child, I stared at her and stood up, speaking calmly. Regarding the divorce, I hope you can give me an answer tomorrow. Felix's voice came from behind, hoarse and tinged with emotion. What if I don't agree? What if I refuse to divorce Emma? I stood at the corner of the staircase, placing my hand on the railing, turning back to look at him. The man I had loved in my youth gradually overlapped with the figure before me. A wave of sorrow surged within me. Felix, these past few years with you, I haven't been happy at all. This unhappiness has been eating away at my life, inch by inch. I let my tears fall, speaking each word clearly. Sometimes, when I fall asleep at night, I wonder if I'll ever wake up again the next day. We should have divorced 4 years ago. These years of futile entanglement were nothing but stubbornness. I kept thinking, why should I step aside for another woman? Felix, like a sculpture made of glass, collapsed onto the soft sofa. His once proud head hung low, his figure sinking into the shadows. He didn't say another word. The next morning when I woke up, Felix was already gone. I looked around the empty villa, realizing he was avoiding me. I couldn't understand, at this point, what was he still holding on to. But since I had made up my mind to divorce and had already spoken to him about it, I felt much lighter. The heavy emotions that had weighed me down for years seemed to vanish all at once. 3 days later, Felix's company hosted a charity gala. Until the divorce was finalized, I still had to attend as Mrs. Felix. On the night of the gala, Felix was, as expected, absent. No one could control him. But that evening, I unexpectedly ran into an old acquaintance. Somewhat unsure, I called out, "Leon?" The man, dressed impeccably in a suit, stood under the lights with an air of aloof elegance. He glanced down at the floor indifferently, his demeanor lazy and detached. When he turned around, the calm expression on his face softened for a brief moment. He hesitated for a second, then walked over, pressing his lips into a polite smile. Emma. I was surprised to see him here. I had personally sent out the invitations for this event, so I naturally remembered sending one to him. What surprised me was that he actually showed up. Leon was famously low-key in the entertainment industry. Despite holding multiple Best Actor awards and having a string of iconic roles under his belt, he remained as inconspicuous as a shadow in the limelight. His fans even joked that acting might just be his side hustle. I remembered one year when a rival company tried to dig up dirt on Leon. They spent 3 whole months investigating him, only to uncover a spotless record of academic and personal excellence from childhood to adulthood. Ironically, their smear campaign ended up elevating his reputation to new heights. Then it dawned on me. Leon had been Felix's college roommate for 4 years. Perhaps he came out of respect for Felix. Back in college, their dorm occasionally had group dinners, and Felix would always bring me along. Over time, we became familiar with each other. I still remembered the first time Felix introduced me to Leon at one of those dinners. We both immediately recognized each other, our eyes betraying the secret. We had crossed paths twice before, purely by chance. To avoid any misunderstandings, I had stood behind Felix and winked at Leon. He had played along seamlessly. Back at our university, there was a popular saying, The computer science department had two standout guys, one like a fiery volcano, the other like an icy mountain. Felix, with his warm and vibrant personality, was the volcano. The aloof and reserved Leon was like an iceberg. Both he and Felix were evenly matched in terms of intellect and family background, and people often compared the two. But back then, those of us close to them knew that Felix and Leon were a cut above the rest. Felix, who seemed destined for an academic path, shocked everyone at Stanford when he dove headfirst into the entertainment industry the year he graduated, causing quite a stir. Thinking back, after college graduation, I don't think I've seen him in person except on TV. I looked up at him now and exchanged pleasantries with a smile. "How have you been these past few years?" Leon's eyes were striking, with a glimmer of starlight in them. He nodded. "I've been well." It had been a long time since we last met, and silence stretched between us. Just as I was about to excuse myself, Leon suddenly spoke, his voice soft and inexplicably tinged with sorrow. "You haven't been happy these past few years." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a rude and intrusive one at that. But his expression was unusually sincere. He was part of that circle, so he must have known about Sophie. Suddenly I remembered the uproar Leon caused on Twitter 2 years ago. Leon, as his fans described him, was a very laid-back person. No matter how others in the entertainment industry tried to slander him or ride on his popularity, he never gave them the time of day. Except for that one time, when Sophie used him for publicity. He personally posted a tweet to refute the rumors. It was hard to imagine someone as cold as him coming up with such sharp words to counter her. Thinking about this, I smiled at him. "Yes, but I'm about to be free from it all." Leon tilted his head slightly, looking at me with a questioning gaze, though he didn't ask anything. He simply curved his lips into a faint smile. "Congratulations." The smile on my lips widened unconsciously, blooming from the depths of my heart. Over these past days, everyone who heard about my impending divorce shook their heads, calling me foolish. They always had their arguments, trying to persuade me to hold on to this broken marriage and secure my position as Mrs. Felix. They'd say, "Felix just has a little mistress. It's not like he doesn't love you." Men are all like this. There's no such thing as a man who doesn't stray. As long as he still comes home, isn't that enough? But this was the first time someone said congratulations to me. I raised my glass and clinked it lightly against Leon's. "Leon, what are you saying to my wife that's making her so happy?" The voice was accompanied by a hand that wrapped around my waist. My body stiffened for a moment, and even the hand holding the glass froze slightly. Felix pulled me halfway into his arms with a casual possessiveness. I looked up and met his emotionless dark eyes. "It's been a while, Alex," I said. Leon glanced at me briefly before extending a polite, distant hand toward Felix. Felix shifted his gaze from me to Leon lazily, curling his lips into a faint smirk. "It really has been a while. I'll make sure someone takes good care of you. Manny and I have something to attend to. Let's catch up properly another time." Hearing this, I cast a glance at Felix, my body tense, unsure of what he was thinking. There was nothing left to say to Felix. I nodded at Leon and left first. What I didn't know was that behind me, Leon called out to Felix. He asked, "You cherished her so much back then. I thought you'd always treat her well." Felix stood there, his expression icy, his gaze at Leon simmering with a barely contained fury, as if he could devour him whole. After a moment, he suddenly let out a nonchalant laugh. "Do you have any connections?" Felix couldn't figure out what he was afraid of. Back in college, he already knew the type of person Leon liked, and it wasn't someone like Emma. Without waiting for Leon to respond, Felix coldly threw out a single sentence. "Leon, stay away from Emma. After that dinner party, Felix seemed to disappear again. I never thought the next time I'd see him would be under such circumstances. On the evening of September 12th, at 5 p.m., a hostage situation occurred at the Bloomfield Trade Center. And, as luck would have it, I was the one with a knife pressed against my neck, taken as a hostage. The scene was utter chaos, people fleeing, calling the police, but without exception, everyone was running away. I, however, couldn't afford to panic. I used every ounce of strength to keep my trembling body steady, but I couldn't stop the fear. The assailant shouted wildly, "Don't come any closer, or I'll kill him. Get the police. I want to talk to the police." But before the police arrived, Felix did. He seemed to have sprinted over from somewhere, his black hair disheveled. The moment he saw me, his face turned ashen. Felix took a few steps forward, which only enraged the assailant further. "Don't come any closer." He steadied his steps, trying to suppress his urgency, his voice calm and composed. "I won't come closer. You want money, right? Let him go. I'll give you whatever you want. The police won't pursue you. I can guarantee your safety." The assailant yelled back, "I don't want money. I want justice. I want the police to negotiate with me." Felix placed everything he had on the ground and raised his phone to show the assailant. "How about this? I'll trade places with him. I'm the chairman of the Felix Corporation. Taking me as a hostage is far more valuable. I can help you negotiate with the police." I stared at him with wide eyes, struggling to speak. "Don't come over. He has a bomb on him." Felix continued to persuade him. He had always been good at convincing people. Coupled with the assailant's heightened emotions, he actually agreed to the exchange. The moment Felix approached, the assailant pulled out another knife and stabbed him hard in the arm, disabling any chance of resistance. Then, with a knife pressed against Felix's neck, he shoved me aside. Felix looked at me deeply, bent over to comply with the assailant, and said hoarsely, "Run! Don't look back. The police will be here soon." I grabbed at the officer's hands, looking back at Felix, pleading with them to save him. They forcibly escorted me out. I crouched on the ground, my mind blank, until I couldn't hold myself up anymore and fell to my knees. Only then did the doors finally open from the inside. There was no explosion as I had feared, nor was there a lifeless Felix. Propping myself up on the steps, my face streaked with tears, I watched as Felix walked out, clutching his injured arm. He came over and scooped me up from the ground, holding me tightly. I buried my head in his chest, sobbing uncontrollably, my heart filled with panic. I called his name, Felix. "I'm here," he murmured softly, his voice strained. Through my tears, I almost screamed at him, "You're not even afraid of dying. Why? Why?" I didn't continue. Felix stayed silent, not pressing me further because we both knew the unspoken question was, "You're not even afraid of dying. Why don't you have the courage to love just one person for a lifetime?" "Felix, is it really that hard to love just one person for a lifetime?" After a long silence, Felix's trembling hand pulled me closer into his arms. His voice was filled with sorrow as he pleaded, "Emmy, let's live well together from now on. I'm begging you." When the incident became a hot topic in the news, Felix left for an overseas business trip. The day before my appointment at the maternity hospital, I sat in my bedroom for what felt like an eternity. From the chirping of birds in the morning to the sun sinking below the horizon, I stayed there, lost in thought. Even the hardest of hearts would find it impossible not to imagine what this child might be like, mischievous or obedient. I raised my hand and gently patted my stomach, tears falling as I whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry to meet you under such unfortunate circumstances. I'm sorry I can't bring you into this world." Yet, at the hospital, I ran into Sophie. That's when I learned that she had been the subject of a massive online scandal recently, her career in the entertainment industry nearly destroyed. As one of her victims, I couldn't deny a certain satisfaction, but I didn't have the energy to mock her. Just as I was about to turn and walk away, Sophie suddenly noticed me and charged toward me. I didn't have time to step back before my bodyguard, who had been following me, restrained her. Sophie glared at me with venom in her eyes and shouted, "It was you, wasn't it? You're the one who convinced Felix to get rid of my child. Emma, you wretched woman." I opened my mouth, staring at her in disbelief, my throat tightening. Sophie struggled violently, her expression shifting from fierce to desperate. Her eyes reddened as she cried, "You're divorcing him anyway! After you're gone, why shouldn't I be the next Mrs. Felix? I've been with him for so many years." She choked on her words. "Emma, I admit I went after him for his money at first. I used every trick in the book to seduce him, to make him invest in me, but now I truly love him. I love him so much. I want to marry him. I want to spend the rest of my life with him." "Sophie," I interrupted her, my voice calm but cutting. "Next time, don't be the other woman in someone else's marriage. It never ends well." I turned away, ignoring her desperate cries behind me. "Emma, please, talk to Felix for me. Tell him not to kick me out, please." After the commotion, I felt drained. I stood at the door of the consultation room for a long time, looking up at the sunlight streaming through the windows. Straightening my back, I walked in resolutely. As that tiny life slowly slipped away from my body, it felt as though my tears had dried up too. It was as if I was crying one last time for the beautiful but failed 12 years of my life. The day after I returned from the hospital, Felix flew back from London. She rushed into the villa, disheveled, and demanded, "Why did you go to the maternity hospital?" "I terminated the pregnancy," I replied. Felix went into a frenzy, smashing everything in the room she could get her hands on. Finally, she turned to me, trembling, her hand clutching her waist as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "Emma, why? That was our child." She collapsed to her knees, covering her face with her hands, her head buried against my legs, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. "Manny, that was our child." I looked at her calmly. The hysterical Felix now was a mirror image of the person I had been 4 years ago, but there was no satisfaction in my heart, only an endless sorrow. This child. It was only because I had softened on her birthday that I let her cross the line again. From the very beginning, this had been a mistake. I sighed. "Felix, let's get a divorce." "I won't agree to it," she said. "Or do you want me to slowly die inside while staying by your side?" I asked. Felix froze at my words, her eyes trembling as she stared at me, her expression filled with helplessness. She locked herself in the bedroom for an entire day. From dawn until dusk, the door remained shut. Only when the sun had set did she finally open it and step out. She looked at me, her tone calm. "Manny, I promise you, taking legal action is the last thing I want to resort to. I don't want things to get ugly." Her willingness to agree so peacefully made me unconsciously breathe a sigh of relief. The divorce proceedings were handled quickly. It only took 3 days. During those 3 days, Felix seemed to revert to his old self, smiling as he took care of everything, and speaking to me in his usual laid-back manner. On the day I left the villa, I was crouched on the floor packing my luggage, while Felix sat quietly on the sofa, watching me. After a long while, he finally spoke. "All the companies under my name, you own 3% of the original shares. You can handle them however you like. The houses on Hillcrest Road and the villa near Westwood Park have been transferred to your name." He placed a bank card on the table. "This card has $30 million deposited in it. Take it." It was the first time I learned about the original shares, but I couldn't be bothered to ask further. The things Felix gave me were enough for me to live comfortably for several lifetimes. I wasn't noble enough to say, I don't want your money. So I took the card and accepted everything. This is what you owe me. Thank you. He leaned back on the sofa, his entire body devoid of energy except for his eyes, which still had a trace of life as they followed my movements. Occasionally, his gaze shifted. About 10 minutes passed before he suddenly said, "Manny, it's late today. Stay one more night, I'll take you tomorrow." I looked up at him, smiled faintly, and shook my head. "No need. My mom's coming to pick me up." When Felix heard this, he immediately stood up. "Your mom's here? I'll go get her." He hurriedly grabbed his coat and was about to head out when I stopped him. "Hey Felix, don't go." He paused, looking at me with some confusion. "My mom used to praise you every time she saw me," I said after a moment's thought. "She'd always tell me how thoughtful and caring you were. I'll tell you this. She really did like you before, but you hurt her daughter. I don't think she'd want to see you now." Felix clenched his fingers tightly, his knuckles turning white. He took a few steps back and slumped back onto the sofa. As I pushed my suitcase to the elevator, Felix sat there with his head lowered, motionless. I called out to him, "Felix." He looked up and responded with a forced smile. I had imagined that divorce would involve shouting, tearing each other apart, and making a public spectacle of ourselves. But I never thought that when the day came, we would part ways with such dignity. I smiled faintly. "I'm leaving." He wanted to see me off, but I stopped him. With the door as the dividing line, we stood on opposite sides. He lowered his head, staring at the threshold, and blinked. "If you ever have something you can't handle, come to me. As long as I'm able, I won't ignore you." I turned around, waved my hand, and left without saying another word. After the divorce, I logged into my long-unused social media account and posted a newly drawn comic. It didn't take long before fans started commenting. "Am I seeing things? Is this really a new piece by October? Upstairs, it's definitely him." I never thought I'd live to see October return to his old art style. "I'm dying over here." Who gets it? October's dark, gloomy style these past few years. If I weren't a true fan, I would have unfollowed ages ago. I thought about the years of an unhappy marriage, how the shadows of that time had seeped into my work, filling it with a sense of death and despair. Once again, I felt that getting divorced was absolutely the right decision. As I scrolled down, I noticed a familiar username. "Beautiful work. I hope you can be happy every day." This username has been one of my longtime followers. I remember back in my sophomore year of college, when I posted my first piece of work, they started following me. Since then, they've silently liked every single one of my posts and left a comment on every piece I created, always saying, "This is great, keep it up." Even when my work in recent years was harshly criticized and torn apart by others, they still left the same comment, "This is great, don't give up." I curved my lips into a smile and replied with a simple, "Thank you." It's strange, really. Lately, the person I've been running into the most is Leon. One time, he was walking a dog. I stared at it for a while before asking, "Is this the same dog?" Back in my sophomore year, Felix and I found an abandoned puppy outside campus. We took it to the vet for a checkup, but then the question arose, who would take care of it? Neither of us were particularly patient people, and I was busy drawing comics at the time. That's when Leon volunteered to take care of it. I thought he'd find someone else to adopt the dog, but to my surprise, he raised it himself. Leon smiled, his dimples faintly visible. "Yes, he's older now and doesn't go out for walks as often." I crouched down, pleasantly surprised, and petted the dog. To my surprise, it was very friendly. I remarked, "You've taken great care of him. Does he have puppies?" Leon paused before replying, "Yes. If you'd like to see them, I think they'd be happy." Without thinking much, I nodded. Sure, maybe sometime. In truth, I didn't plan on actually going to see the puppies. It felt too personal and inappropriate. But the next day, Leon brought one of the puppies over. As soon as it saw me, it wagged its tail enthusiastically, full of affection. No one can resist a friendly puppy, and I was no exception. I could only blame Leon for raising them to be so approachable. Later, I found out that Leon's dogs were usually aloof. Much like him. Most people couldn't even get close enough to touch them. In the adult world, it's easy to see through emotions, especially with someone like Leon, who doesn't bother to hide his feelings. Eventually, I had to tell him, "Leon, I'm not ready to start a new relationship. I really enjoy my life as it is now, and honestly, I have a fear of marriage." Leon pressed his lips together and smiled gently. "Emmy, don't be afraid. Let me tell you this, I like you. Not because I expect you to respond or be with me. I just want you to know that no matter what, whether you're happy or sad, there's someone in this world who is captivated by you, who admires you. That was true before, and it will always be true." Sometimes I wonder how Leon manages to blend coldness and warmth so seamlessly. 2 years later, Leon's long quiet studio announced his marriage, sparking a social media frenzy. Amid the shock and discussions, people began digging into the identity of Leon's wife. Following the clues, they discovered she was the ex-wife of the chairman of the Felix Group. Some people couldn't accept this and flooded Leon's social media, calling him a stepfather for marrying a divorced woman. Others went as far as to attack the Felix Group's official accounts, forcing them to shut down their comment sections. Sensing an opportunity, financial reporters interviewed Felix, asking for his thoughts. Felix stared at the camera for a long time before simply saying, "Congratulations." At the press conference Leon held, he spoke with sincerity and conviction. "If it weren't for her, I probably won't get married in this lifetime, so I hope you can be happy for me. The fact that I even have a chance to get married in this life feels like fate showing me mercy." After the press conference, the internet fell into an inexplicable silence. Throughout Leon's life, no matter what the entertainment industry or the public said about him, he never cared. The only 2 times he caused a stir with his high-profile actions were both because of Emma. After the silence, fans unearthed Leon's secret social media account and discovered a secret he had hidden for years. On the day Leon debuted, he had posted a message on that account, "If I stand tall enough, will he be able to see me?" Suddenly, the internet exploded with heated discussions. Some writers even began creating fan fiction about the love triangle between Leon, Emma, and Felix. Emma lowered her head, scrolling through the posts from these detective-like fans. She clicked on the familiar ID and then, holding her phone, ran barefoot into the kitchen. Leon, dressed in light gray loungewear, was bent over slicing fruit for Emma. Tentatively, Emma called out, "October? Leon, still focused on the fruit platter, responded instinctively. The next second, his body stiffened. He turned to glance at Emma, then quickly looked away, muttering softly, "I don't know what you're talking about. Go put on your shoes." Emma looked at the phone screen displaying the account named October, then looked back at Leon. She covered her forehead and burst into loud laughter. Behind her, Leon couldn't help but laugh along with her, caught up in her exaggerated and carefree laughter. Leon and Emma's wedding became the talk of the town. On their wedding day, Dylan rushed from the airport to the venue. As he got out of the car, he ran into an old acquaintance at the entrance. Dylan checked the time. He wasn't late, so he walked over and patted Felix on the shoulder. "Aren't you going in?" Felix fiddled with a cigarette in his hand, glanced up at the grand and luxurious building, and watched as guests hurried in amidst the festive clamor. He pulled out a box and handed it to Dylan. "A wedding gift. Take it in for me." Dylan accepted the box and raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Felix, caught off guard by the smoke, coughed for a while until his eyes watered. Then he smiled and said, "I'm afraid he won't accept it." After a pause, he added, "Don't tell them it's from me." Dylan asked again, "Are you really not going in?" Felix shook his head. "What's there to see? Watching them vow to grow old together in front of a crowd? Watching them in love?" He couldn't bear to witness it. The person he had once held so dearly in his heart, the person he had cherished and exhausted all his strength to embrace, was now in someone else's arms. Dylan patted Felix on the shoulder. "I'm heading in to grab a drink." Maybe for someone like Dylan, who had never truly had it, it wasn't so hard to let go. It wasn't so devastating. Dylan watched as Felix slowly walked away, blending into the crowd. His figure seemed desolate and lonely. Dylan smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. His intuition told him that Felix would never move on. This was just the beginning. Felix, summoning all his strength, got into his car and stared blankly at the towering building. He could never have imagined that Leon had hidden his feelings for so many years. When Felix found out, he had been so furious he wanted to kill him. Felix lowered his head and suddenly started laughing, his chest shaking with the force of it. He would never tell Emma that his favorite birthday gift was one filled with comic card box, was called the most thoughtful gift by him. It was the gift he had prepared for him that year but never got the chance to deliver. Leon had proactively handed it over to him, and when Emma left, the birthday gift he cherished the most was left behind, gathering dust in the villa. He would never tell Emma that during the year when rumors and slander about him spread online, before he could even respond, Leon had resolved everything on his own. At that time, Felix patted him on the shoulder, calling him a good brother. Leon didn't say a word. Felix had always thought it was because of him that Leon stepped in to help. Looking back now, every word felt like a knife stabbing straight into his chest. For the rest of his life, he would never tell Emma about the things Leon had done. He would take those secrets to the grave. He was selfish enough to deny them any chance of a deeper love. The car slowly drove into the night, and Felix grew further and further away from the joy and laughter behind him.